we are starting in on the history of optimal, which means we have to go into a little bit of the history of neurofeedback. Many times people will say, why do we need to know this part? And honestly, not only do I personally find it fascinating, but I also think that the more you can understand about where we came from and what we started as, the more you'll understand why we went in the direction that Val did at the time. So plus I think it does give you a little bit more understanding as to the differences between the two approaches, which I think in all is always helpful.
And if you're in a professional environment, people are going to come in and say, so and so down the street is offering neurofeedback, and they say they have to have a cue. They say this. It's a good reason to have an understanding of what those other systems are.
The history of Neuroptimal. Obviously the biggest change is that somehow Val, in the middle of a very strong linear program, created a nonlinear system. And it took a system or two, as you will find, for that to happen. But in Val's head, and I'm saying Val, but really Sue came along soon thereafter, and she was a very active part of it at that point. So when they created Zengar Institute, the mission of it was to create, deliver, and support the most effective and safe brain training system available in the world. Now, in their minds, what they were also saying, and actually this mission statement is considerably long. This is just a couple of little sections that I pulled out of it. But really what they were saying is that it's not just that it needed to be safe for everyone, but that the idea that if people could do it on themselves, then it would be open to everyone. And so it was really something that was a fight to the whole system, to the whole neurofeedback field, because in their minds, no, you have to have a therapist. And honestly, a neuropsychologist was the first part of that. They only wanted neuropsychologists to be able to do it. Then it opened up to psychologists, then it opened up to social workers. And so, it started to change a little bit. And really now they still are very supportive of anyone in the mental health field. But in the beginning, they were very particular about who they felt could provide this service to someone, because in their minds, it was always medical. And therefore you needed to know a lot about the brain to be able to provide this service. In the beginning, the process started late 60s, early 70s with a very famous in our field. I don't know how famous it is to the whole world, but a very famous research program by Barry Stearman. He really changed the field of neurofeedback. Up to this point, it was just that we could measure electrical activity in the brain. And for the first time ever, Barry wanted to know, well, if there are seizures going on in someone's head and it is like a storm of electrical activity, how can we stop that from happening? What could we do that would inhibit seizure activity? And so he did an experiment on cats. And the way he did it, what he did was he put these sensors into and onto the brain. And he monitored these cats trying to induce a seizure. What he found was really, really interesting. He found that anytime a cat got ready to pounce, so its body was physically very, very, very still, but its brain was very, 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 very fast, they were in what he coined as a sensory motor rhythm, which meant that they were producing more intense 14 hertz activity than at any other time when they were just eating or walking or doing anything else. So he discovered a state called the sensory motor rhythm, SMR. And even to this day, we still use SMR. Now, we don't in Neuroptimal, but within the field of linear neurofeedback, it is still one of the major protocols that people use. So the takeaway was that there was this new frequency. It was coined SMR for a still body and an active mind. Then came along what they called an alpha theta protocol. Now, there was a couple of guys. Peniston was the big one, but Eugene Peniston created this alpha theta program or protocol for addictions. And what he found was he took a large group of prisoners and he did neurofeedback with them and found that the ratio between alpha and theta was almost exactly the opposite. And so by doing this alpha theta protocol, he was able to kind of renormalize that ratio, and addictions not only started going down, but then 2 and 3 and 4 years later, they would go back to those same people and they still were not doing their drinking or their drugs or whatever it is that they were addicted to. And this really encompassed all addictions. So the takeaway from this particular protocol was that a whole new set of frequencies showed state shifts between eyes open and eyes closed were important within that linear, non-dynamical field. Now, remember that for us now, we say we don't believe in states. We don't believe that people will go to a particular state and stay there. So instead, we believe in generalities. They are generally able to produce the frequencies they need to be able to fall asleep and stay asleep. For some people, that is going to be your, your delta and your theta and so forth. For other people, it may be that they are most comfortable in the alpha, but everybody's just a little bit different. And so it is one of those things that is just general and not state specific. But we're still talking the linear program, and this is how they got started, was with these state protocols. So then they would create a protocol that was just for people with addictions or just for people that had concerns like this one with ADHD. And this was Joe Lubar, who said, boy, if we were to look at the theta beta ratio and producing more alpha state, then people would stay focused for longer. And so what Joe Lubar came up with in the 70s was this state-based program for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so he noticed that, again, there was also the state of eyes open and eyes closed. So if you trained for your eyes open in an alpha state, then you would be more focused and less monkey brain, less moving all over the place. So then Val came in, and Val came in with a variety of expertise. He has several degrees, but he has knowledge in so many different areas. So for him to be able to make the neuroptimal process, his background, his degrees in psychology as a clinical psychologist, and his knowledge in engineering and computer science and mathematics was able to produce the actual program. But he also has a very strong background in spiritualism, nonlinear dynamics, philosophy, and of course, neurology. And so it took all of these different incredible backgrounds to be able to produce a nonlinear dynamical program. So we want to take a look at how he did what he did.
The 5-phase model kind of evolved out of something I'd been working on throughout my early years as a psychiatric technician. And that was really what became the solution-oriented rapid transformation or SORT method. And I started with the premise that I found through the years I could really talk to anybody. And it got quite surprising to me that Many others in the field, and particularly the psychiatrists and psychologists, the heavy hitters at that time, had all these presuppositions about, oh, well, you can't do psychotherapy with a schizophrenic, or you can't do it with this or with that, or, the problem is the resistance of the client, and those kinds of things. And, from my perspective, I always started with the idea from Harry Stack Sullivan, we're all more simply human than otherwise, and really did not like to use labels in describing people, because particularly thinking that they're disorders, the thing that happens when people get labeled is you're really describing the orderly patterns of their behavior. So why do we call it a disorder? It's just that we dislike that particular orderliness. So a lot of presuppositions in that approach. And so I started trying to put into words what I was doing that allowed me to work pretty seamlessly with just about anybody back in the day, using voice primarily, but also body language, just really simple, straightforward stuff. And so I developed this language of these 5 phases of communication: meeting, joining, developing, transforming, and resolving, or re-solving. So in meeting, you meet the client. Now, what defines a client? Most approaches think in terms of a client as someone who has a problem. Well, I think that's exactly backwards. A problem is only a problem because you don't want it. I used to do a lot of work with families that had an angry adolescent in them. And they'd come in and frequently say, well, the problem is he wants to stay out late at night, and we don't want that. And for me, that's like, well, then you guys have the problem. The parents have the problem, because you're the ones who don't want. What do you want? Do you tell him what you want? What do you do when you get what you want from him, when the behavior is the way you want it to be? If you're always looking for what you don't want, you're going to always find a lot of what you don't want. So you have to meet the client. What makes someone a client is that they have something they don't want, and they want to change. You don't have those 2 criteria. If you don't meet that every time you start a conversation, then you don't have a client for transformational work. Now, what might the adolescent want? The adolescent might want his parents to get off his back. Okay, that's a great starting point. And it doesn't help to have an argument about which problem is the real problem, because real is just a belief system. That both things are not wanted, and they're not wanted by different people. And so you have to meet all of those people. So meet the client, find out what it is that they don't want, and what is it they want to change. Because, the adolescent will say, well, I want my parents to get off my back. I want them to change. And the parents will say, well, we want him to come in on time and do what we ask him to do. Okay, those are interesting things. And no wonder all of you feel powerless, because you're wanting other people to be different so you feel okay. That's a really great way to set yourself up. So what's the next thing? Well, the next phase when you have a client is to join the client's story. And the client's story is almost always completely about their problem. Now, the interesting thing about that, they might say, well, I'm depressed, and I've been depressed forever. I'm always depressed. Well, if that were true, literally true, they wouldn't know that they were depressed, because there'd be no contrast point. The story that I'm always depressed, and I always have been, and I always will be, is a great example of making sure that the problem continues, because you cut out finding any times or experiences where the problem was different, where it was less not wanted, where things were a little better, where things were a little different. I remember working with this one couple, and they came in and they were sort of on the edge of going for a divorce and fighting all the time and all of that. And of course, they both wanted to talk about the problem. and from their perspectives. And that was important to begin to meet them, but then I had to join them and get really into that without picking a side. It's important when you join with whichever person you're talking to, you join with the couple, if it's a couple, join with the family, etc., so that they feel understood by you as they understand themselves to be. Once the joining happens, and you can tell, because there'll be a bit of a relaxation, there'll be a sense of rapport that gets built, because they'll feel very understood, and that's really the bottom line of joining. The next phase is developing. What happens in developing? Well, you get the rest of the story, because the client's story is always about the problem, and they leave out the solutions that allow them to say, well, I have the problem now because the things I know that solve it aren't happening or stopped happening or whatever. So with the couple that was on the edge of getting divorced, after they were very clearly felt that I understood them as they understood themselves to be, different as those understandings were for each of them, I then said, we'll talk about all that a little bit more. But what I'd like to know is, how did you guys choose to get together? What did you do? Nobody walks up to someone and says, oh yeah, let's get married, and in 5 years I'm going to hate you and let's get divorced. That's a great plan. No, instead they find someone who does a lot of stuff that they do probably, or if not, does interesting stuff, and you join them in that interesting stuff. And so in talking to them, they're very surprised that I was asking, how'd you guys get together? Like, what'd you do? And they sort of thought for a moment and said, well, we used to go out and eat dinner at this particular restaurant. And, it wasn't that it was like top notch or whatever. It's just, it became our place. They said, oh, when was the last time you did that? And they both looked at me stunned. They said, oh, wow, probably years. That's a whole part of the story that they have forgotten, because they're so into the pain and the suffering of the don't want, how things are going badly between them in their experiences, that they forget how they got together in the first place. So if you're working on creating the ending of something, it's tougher to remember the beginnings and the joy and the love and the laughter and everything else in that. Well, once we sort of fleshed that out, and I had him tell me more about this particular restaurant, and what about it was so interesting, and pretty soon they were laughing together about, oh, you remember there was the really awful decorations, and et cetera, et cetera. But oh, we really loved the people who owned it and got to be very close to them as customers, and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, oh, okay, well, now it's time that we're going into transforming, was the thought in my head. And I said, well, would you be willing to, over the next week, go there at least once and see what it's like? Maybe it's exactly the same. Maybe it's changed a lot. Maybe you'll go there and say, oh, wow, why did we like this? Well, whatever. Would you be willing to do that? So I'm telling the whole story. By doing that, I'm saying, let's go back and recreate your relationship if it's recreatable. This is how you got together in the first place. You guys know how to do this, and you enjoyed it. Why don't you give it a try and see what happens? That, of course, sets up the resolving, because they're now solving again this original problem, this original don't want in their relationship, by remembering the whole story, how they got together originally, what was good about that, that's a resource, that yes, they can do that. And let's see if that makes a difference. And as it turned out, of course, that started the whole road to recreating their relationship and their love for each other. Now, I've blended together a number of stories and different parts of my personal history and all of that. But needless to say, this actually became the core of my doctoral dissertation. And then that became the basis of the 5-phase model of neurofeedback. And over time, as technology advanced, it was able to shift into the period 3 approach, and then ultimately what you all know now as the dynamical neurofeedback method known as Neuroptimal. Now, it's important to understand that things don't always go the way that we hope they will. In fact, frequently, it's because of the mistakes we make that we do the most learning. And so it's important to think of failure as just the first attempt in learning something. It's an acronym. It's not you did something bad or horrible. And that applies especially to something like the SORT method, because this isn't something that you do to someone else to have a certain outcome. It's something that the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of you actually do together. It's a dance. And the dance has a lot of possible turns and twists and different places that it can go instead of this seemingly smooth, always moving forward. And in the diagram, you'll see that we have red arrows that kind of go in the opposite direction of the blue arrows. That's meant to indicate that it's not like you don't develop correctly and then the game is over, or the process is over, or the session's over, or whatever you're trying to do is over and just done. No, it just means that you have to step back so that you go back and recoup from the prior phase. So you're developing and you're trying to be problem focused is the phrase that used to come up with a solution to that problem, and really move the thing along. And of course, you lose rapport in doing that. So you then step back and you might say something like, well, help me understand if I'm really getting what you're trying to say here. And you then can repeat whatever you understood the client's story to be. And frequently that little step back from developing to joining is enough to then start to develop again. But it's also an indication that you may be trying to make things happen too quickly. And that's about your sense of what should happen instead of simply calm assertiveness in the present moment and thoroughgoing, grounded respect in the self-transformational possibilities of every human being. One of the real strengths of Neuroptimal is that we specifically don't do anything to the client. We're just giving them information about what they just did. And we're giving it to the brain in a way that is the same as it communicates internally. And we'll talk about all that at a later point. But you need to think of Neuroptimal as implementing this kind of subtle dance of recouping where needed. Maybe you've gone too quickly to transforming and you didn't develop all the resources that would be useful. It might sound from the story I gave of the couple that, well, you just pull one thing out and then you just assign that. No, that's not it at all. It's just a simplified way of trying to convey this communicative flow, this communicative dance, this cooperative dance that goes on and that is always led by the client. And remember, the client is the one who has a don't want, and they want something to change. And those two don't have to be the same.
Now, you kind of ask, why is that important? That is exactly what goes on in the Neuroptimal system. So they, kind of backstage within O, we have this ability mathematically to meet with them, measure what their cortical activity is, and go through this same type of development and transforming throughout the process the more they do it. So what he did was he took this idea of how he was doing therapy and he put it into neurofeedback. It was called the 5-phase model. And with the 5-phase model, what it meant was and you got to remember, this was at the very beginning when he had no neurooptimal system. He didn't have a computer. He didn't have anything that moved as fast as what we have now. I mean, they had a computer, but it was not at the speed at which it would take to do dynamical neurofeedback. And the majority of what was going on in the field, all of the software was from the linear processes. So he started this whole idea with using somebody else's software, somebody else's computer, somebody else's encoder or amplifier, and he created these little, at the time they were floppy disks. And on these floppy disks, he was able to recreate what was actually out in the world with what he had to deal with. So he had this SMR protocol that was a state-based protocol that was known for calming and centering people. And he took that 5-phase idea and started it with the idea of being very calm and centered. Now, when I say SMR, I also have with 3 and 5 hertz inhibits. Now, we talked about what inhibits were. It was that the thresholds were set small enough, short enough, that the cortical activity or the EEG couldn't go past it without getting an interruption. 3 and 5 hertz means that it was in the frequency of 3 and 5 hertz, because Val discovered that 3 and 5 hertz were trauma frequencies. So if someone had a 3 and a 5 hertz that was surging, meaning it was massive, it was strong, it was an intense frequency, then more than likely they had trauma in their background and or were being triggered at that time. And so he put inhibits on there so that they would not get triggered when they did the neurofeedback. He did about 5 minutes of SMR, and then he would go into 5 minutes of beta. Now, that also had the 3 and the 5 hertz inhibits because he did not want, as he moved higher in the frequency levels, he didn't want anybody to freak out. And so what he did was he started it out at calm, moved into a focused state. Now, the ability to move from SMR and into beta was supposed to help with resilience. Now, this is way back in, late 80s, early 90s, and look at what he's done. At this point in time, he's already talking resilience. I mean, this was something that has always been around. Now, this particular 5-phase model is what I did my PhD on with Val. So this is something that I'm really was very into, because this was when I moved over and into Val world. I left the linear world and went into Val world, and I'd already been in the linear world for 4 or 5 years and decided that I was going to follow this man because it just seemed as though it was really working with the whole body. It wasn't just working with specific frequency levels. Now, I have to say at this point, this is still a linear protocol. This is not dynamical yet, because he had everybody else's equipment and everybody else's software. So he went from calming, centering, SMR into beta, which is focused, and then down to the alpha. Now, this is where if we were going to lose somebody into a more with a trauma background, this is where we were going to lose them, because going down 3 to 5 hertz is a slower frequency level. And so moving into that relaxed state is just about where we would have lost somebody if we were. Each one of these was about 5 minutes apiece. We were still doing 3 and 5 hertz inhibits when we talk about, introducing the alpha. And then as we moved into here, he took away the inhibits. So this was in his mind, intrinsically inhibited. Let's see if you can produce alpha, be relaxed, without any inhibits. We inhibited it 3 times for you. So we've got 15 minutes of inhibiting going on. And now we're going to go for another 5 minutes without it. And then it went into global synchrony, meaning we're going to do this last bit and we are not going to do anything. We have no inhibits. We have no augments, nothing. We are just going into global synchrony. Now, remember that when they say SMR, beta, alpha, that means that they are augmenting SMR. They're augmenting beta. They're augmenting alpha. So SMR was the 14 hertz, beta is 15 to 18 hertz. Alpha is back down to the 8 hertz area, 8 to 13. And then we continue on around to this global synchrony, which is going then back into SMR, which is the calming centering again. So this 5-phase model followed the solution-oriented rapid transformation with meeting, joining, developing, and transforming, resolving, and then coming back to meeting. And this was exactly what he did with this 5-phase. And we did that for a few years until, and it was very, very, very rewarding. It worked incredibly well. If you look at my research, I did it with children, and I did it with children that had problems with language disorders, which we would consider, autism. Anything that has to do with reading, writing, listening, or speaking was a language disorder. So that means we did ADD and ADHD, we had autism, we had such a huge group of people. And during that time, what we found was that all of the children had an incredible burst of language. I mean, those that weren't talking very well, all of a sudden were talking a mile a minute. Those that had problems with grammar, all of a sudden started really understanding it and learning and producing it differently. It was phenomenal, and I have the records for that. It's in our research department, so if anybody's interested in taking a look at that, it was all done with this 5-phase model. It went from 5-phase to period 3. Now, period 3 is where Val and Sue really got together, and Sue brought in all of her expertise, and she has, believe it or not, she has 5 higher level degrees, and one of them is in clinical psychology. She was a nurse actually she was born and raised in England, and so that was kind of her background and where she started at, but she brought in a lot of the clinical stuff that Val was very happy to get rid of, because the one thing they both agreed with is that you never have to relive or talk about anything. You don't have to re-present it. Val being from kind of his Buddhist background, in his mind, when you re-present, then you actually are strengthening those neural pathways and creating a more solid story. It's creating more of that persistent, consistent pattern in the brain. And so that was the one thing both of them agreed upon, is that this process could eliminate that, so that you never had to really talk about your problems again, because in their minds, and it really slowed the process down a lot. So the takeaway from this is that we now have an internal reduction of switching protocols. What they did was they took that 5 different 5-minute phase and turned it into 10-minute increments. And they started with both beta and SMR, because the one thing that Sue discovered was there was an encoder at the time that allowed you to do 2-channel EEG, meaning that you could do the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. When we did the 5-phase model, we didn't have the left and the right. We only had the top, the center. And so we only had one active center, one reference, and one ground. And so now Sue says, why can't we do left and right hemisphere? And why can't we do them at the same time? We could do beta on the left because, of course, the left was well known, the left hemisphere is well known for being the organized, straightforward, linear left hemisphere, while the right was the creative gestalt type thing. And so let's do the relaxed, or the SMR, the calming one on the right. We'll do on the left the real high beta so that people are focused and so forth. And then we'll still keep the inhibits of the 3 and the 5 hertz. Now, they are still, again, with a linear approach. They still have somebody else's encoder. They still have somebody else's software. So they're still now creating those hard disks, those little 3x5 disks that are harder, and you put into them. And I remember it used to take 12 of them to put their entire program into somebody else's program. It was really fun. But they still had these inhibits, the 3 and the 5 hertz inhibits. And so they were doing two things at the same time. Now, everybody in the field was saying, oh my gosh, the brain can't do two things at one time. There's no way. That makes no sense whatsoever. Well, obviously, it not only made a lot of sense, and the brain can do many, many, many more things. When you listen to Sue talk about it, it's really cute. And she does in the advanced course. We have a little video of her talking about it. She's like, she goes, it just surprised us all that the brain could do that. And, you think back on it now and, oh my gosh, the idea that the brain can't do it is funny. Then it went from there, after this 10 minutes, into concurrent alpha, 5 minutes with the 3 and 5 hertz inhibits, and then 5 minutes without those inhibits. And then it went into global synchrony. In the end, they found it helped with focus, it helped with resilience, it helped people be more calm and centered, and it allowed people to be intrinsically inhibited, doing it on their own. So again, the takeaway from this was just an internal reduction of switching protocols. So things were now done concurrently with the training, and it helped people really kind of move towards this feeling of being both focused and relaxed at the same time. So that in some ways, and in what they had hoped, was that it kept the brain continually reorganizing itself. So from the period 3 approach, moved into NeuroCare Pro. The NeuroCare Pro was really interesting because it brought along a lot of things. One, it brought along their own software, recreating this program. And this one was really kind of started from bottom up, meaning they still had the idea that they had with period 3 approach, but it really is more dynamical now. Really, they're doing several things at the same time. They have 2 channels, left and right hemisphere, going on, and they've created these target levels that were not thresholds. They'd taken away the thresholds so that it really was more of what we would consider today to be more dynamical. They introduced the JTFA for the first time, and was able to really do more of a mathematical process using the Gabor-based transforms. Some of you will hear Val talk about Carl Pribram. Carl and Val met up, probably at the late period 5, the 5-phase model. And they really hit it off because Carl was very, very much geared towards the language the central nervous system uses. And when he found out what Val was doing, one of the comments that he made was he could really foresee the idea that neuroptimal, or not neuroptimal at that point, but neurofeedback could replace how the brain communicated with itself. And he could really understand that it could, almost as a sensory filter, be able to help the brain understand how to come back to present moment. Again, that one was a little bit of Val's Buddhism coming in. So we had just a variety of things coming in here. We had the mathematics that Val had really spent a lot of time. Obviously, as an engineer, he created his own program at this point. So, and the computer science. So he's starting to really bring in all of the different elements of what he personally was an expert in, truthfully. He created these Zen X modes. The Zen X modes were the idea that you had one small time, which I believe was about 5 minutes, that you would do Zen 1, and then you'd go into Zen 2, which took you into a different difficulty level. Now, part of the reason why he had these Zen X modes, it was Zen 1, 2, 3, and 4. Part of the reason why he had that was computers still weren't fast enough to do everything he wanted and dreamed of them doing. And so he had to make these targets to where he was able to have different difficulty levels in each of the 4 different areas, which took you through the idea that this is going to be a little tougher for the brain, this is a little easier, then we're going to, kind of, it was almost like going through an exercise routine, where you'd warm up, then you'd go into actually doing some more defined exercises before you went into the aerobic stage and then back into a cool down stage. So that was kind of how they described it, was you had these 4 different exercise places for the brain. The trainer was in charge of the difficulty level. We were able to push the up button and the down button, and it was able to make it so that it still had internal thresholds, but in a different way. It had these boxes, and we that were the target boxes, and those boxes were able to go closer together to make it harder for the person, and or move further away from that center line to make it easier for the person. And we had to listen to what we considered the 80-20 rule. We had to, we wanted 80% positive feedback and 20% negative feedback, kind of Pareto's rule. So that is what ended up going into NeuroCare Pro. Now, NeuroCare Pro was kind of the model for Neuroptimal, for the beginnings of Neuroptimal. We had a philosophy that went along with it. Val's really into these acronyms, but the care part, which was capitalized in NeuroCare Pro, stood for Comprehensive Adaptive Renormalization of the EEG. Now, again, I talked about renormalization not long ago when I was talking about the example of somebody that was having a little bit of difficulty with the change that was going on. The renormalization in this context meant that your brain was able to re-communicate with itself. So comprehensive meaning we're doing, just like Mark showed you that phasor earlier, the idea that we're using all of the frequencies all at one time. It's adapting to wherever this brain is in that very moment. They're renormalizing back to a time when they're flexible and resilient and can communicate within its own CNS, and we're using EEG to do that. So with the care model, what it really meant was we were able to give the central nervous system information. The joint time frequency analysis was used within the process to mimic the method of communication that the central nervous system naturally used. So that renormalization is really going back to a place when somebody really felt that they were feeling better. They were able to communicate within their own system. They were able to react and respond, and really they were able to live what they would consider a balanced or well-developed life. And that isn't always the case. I mean, if you were to measure their cortical activity, left to right hemisphere, you wouldn't always see that it was balanced, because we aren't. There is no absolute value, right? We're just generally feeling good. And we all have days like that where we wake up and we woke up on the wrong side of the bed. We have, little phrases for it, but it's primarily saying we're not feeling quite ourselves. And those symptoms are far worse. A real good example of that is tinnitus. All of us, if we were in a really quiet spot and we were just really listening, you'd hear buzzing or ringing, or you'd hear something in your ears. It's the flow of the blood that's going through. It's the internal working that is bugging us. We hear it. And yet there are other days where we wouldn't notice it. I mean, it just doesn't even come up. We don't, even though we have tinnitus, we don't pay any attention to it. Some people call it tinnitus, but we don't pay any attention to it. And that's kind of the way it is with other symptoms. There are just some days when somebody might think they feel depressed, but it's a good day. They don't seem to notice much. They've got their grandkids there or something fun's happening, and it's just not quite so noticeable. Then there's other days where that is a horrible problem. I mean, it is just something that they can't get out of their mind. They're so hyper focused on it. And so this renormalization allows you to go from being alone to being with your grandkids to being able to work at work and be able to do all these different things that you need to do and be able to function. And that is what we call renormalization, or we also can call it transformation. It's the idea that we can quickly move through whatever turbulent stuff is going on in our lives and be able to feel comfortable with it. So now the one that came right before this was version 2.0. Now version 2.0 kind of has some of the same look. It has the same matrix mirror that's here, but you'll see over here on the side that it has some other buttons and other options that we do not have anymore. And for good reason, because a lot of times when people think they have something, a lot of times they will, again, remember how I talked about earlier how the brain needs to make sense of the things that the information that's coming into them. And so a lot of times when they would see some of these other fun little options that really were only there because Val needed them for measurements to be able to change the joint time frequency analysis mathematics in the program, people would look at it and make up that, oh, well, if I see this, we had a variety of different tools that we would look at, and immediately somebody would say, oh, that means you have too much fish oil, or you need fish oil, or you have too much caffeine, or you have, and people were just making up all of this stuff that would go along with it because they felt as a trainer that it was important for them to be able to add professionalism, to be able to add their education to the process. So what version 2.0 brought us was it transitioned into what we now have as a full auto navigation system, meaning it can run totally on its own. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to set the difficulty levels on it. We didn't have to do any of that with 2.0. We allowed the neuroptimal system to kind of dance with the EEG, meaning that the neuroptimal process actually would notice where that person's brain was in that moment and immediately keep mirroring it back to them and showing that person what it was that brain was doing in that moment. And that was what we considered the dance, because we weren't telling the person anything. We weren't changing anything for them. They personally were just sitting on this EEG machine, and this machine was actually mirroring it back, and they would just go back and forth. Here is your activity. Oh, I don't want that. And it would change immediately. So then the process would show a different picture, and then it would keep changing. And so it was that fun little EEG dance that was going on. Lots and lots of options within 2.0. what was actually brought into NO3 really means we're hands off entirely. We can be in the room. And Mark and I, the way we always presented our offices were, we could leave you, and here's a little bell that you can ding and we'll come back in as soon as we hear it. Or we can sit over here and do our work off to one side while you do your session. But we always made it very clear that this was their session and they were getting out of it what they needed to get out of it, that we were here for support. We were here to help them notice those changes, but that it really was them doing it. So what NeurOptimal 3 or NO3 brought to us was that it is 100% dynamical feedback now. The computers are fast enough, the Microsoft is quick enough, everything is the way Val, this is what Val wanted all along. It changes everything. It is his baby. It is nonlinear dynamical neurofeedback, 100%. It has an exclusive JTFA algorithm. Now, what that actually entails is, and again, we get into this a lot in the advanced course, but the mathematics that go into what we call time frequency envelopes, TFEs, that is those little boxes that we see within the mirror matrix on the side of all of those colored lines, the frequency lines. Those TFEs have an algorithm that is constantly helping. They're the ones that create the interruptions for the person. And it's that mathematical algorithm of those little boxes on the side that is kind of proprietary. It is what Val calls his secret sauce. We don't know exactly what that algorithm is. And to be very honest, unless you are a mathematician, I don't think it even matter if you did know, because, it would take a very unique, special person to be able to recreate what he has created. So NeurOptimal also has 100% training and not treatment. There is nothing that has to do with the treatment anymore. You don't need a diagnosis. We don't have a protocol. We don't have any kind of a prognosis, nor can we predict or judge what's going to happen in the next session. So 100% it is now training. And even though that is something that Val has always considered it to be, you also could look back on some of those other parts of the programs and understand and realize that because we were able to interject our thoughts into it, whether it was changing the difficulty level or whatever, it still was not 100% training. Even though that's kind of the way it should have been used, it really wasn't until now. Now, there is no question about it. We are not even in the picture anymore, which in many ways is kind of scary to some therapists. The idea that they're not needed in this process. And you are needed. Your role has just changed a little. You are needed. And again, as a neuropsychologist, my role changed. Now, I've never been a person, you guys kind of know me now, I've never been a person that has always felt like, because I'm the therapist, you're here, you got a problem, I don't. It's never equated to that. And I'm sure it doesn't equate to that for most of you either, because you get into it because you want to help heal. You want people to feel better and you want to be a part of that. And so you still are very much a part of that. It's just in a different way now. And we will talk a lot about that when we talk about the role of the trainer and the role of the client. So we now have comprehensive and adaptive training that's dynamical. It's constantly responsive to that individual, dependent upon what they do. This is why we can't say it's one size fits all, because it is always moving. It kind of reminds me of, you remember those kaleidoscopes that you look in? Every time you move it, it turns into a different picture. Well, that's kind of what's going on in the brain. Every single time, every millisecond, a new thought comes up, a new process comes up, it is changing the way the brain is working, what it looks like. And that is constantly being adjusted. And when the neurooptimal system mirrors it back to that person, then all of a sudden it is changed again. So we have those time frequency envelopes, which we talked about a second ago, the TFEs, which really is the linguistic language of the CNS. So when we talk about what makes neurooptimal system the same, or give the impression of the communicating with the CNS, it's really those time frequency envelopes that are doing that. It's that mathematical interruption that stops that persistent, consistent pattern that is immediately bringing that person back to the present moment so they can make a decision as to whether, where they want to be. And this is happening so fast, so quick, and it's not a conscious decision. I'm not going to see my cortical activity and say, oh, I don't like that. I think I want a different picture. That is not the way it is doing it. Instead, anytime there is a difference in the electrical configuration, then the brain is going to respond one way or the other. Just like if I'm uncomfortable in my seat, I'm going to get up. I won't think about it. I'll just get up and switch over and go to a different position, and there you have it. It's a done deal. If you're driving down the road and you're not really 100% thinking, because we kind of zone off when we're driving and thinking about different things, and all of a sudden you start to go off and onto those rumble strips. That's information. You have a choice. You can keep going off the road and take the exit, or you can say, oh my gosh, and get back on the road and start to drive again. And that is kind of what is happening, is that those interruptions, those are our rumble strips. They are giving us the information as to where we are, just like the mirrors underneath that balance beam, so that you can make the decision as to where you want to place your foot next time. And it's all the same. If we were taking our temperature and we see that our temperature, we're feeling kind of funny, we're just, we're starting to sweat a little bit, and we take our temperature and we realize, oh my gosh, my temperature is 103. That's feedback as to what's going on with your body. You have the choice then. Should I take some Tylenol, or should I let this go? Let my body fight it off. And it's just information, and that's all we do all the way down the line. So Neurooptimal is mirroring back that information to the central nervous system. And we're doing that 256 times per second, which is really important. Just kind of overall to see the history again, 1993 to 2000 about, we have the 5-phase model and period 3 approach. 2003 to about 2018, we have NeuroCare Pro and into V2. And then in 2018, we came out with NO3. We do call NO as in Neurooptimal 3 and V2 as in version 2.